Jeremy Scahill coming to you from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. Well, there's less than 2 weeks remaining before Donald Trump's inauguration, and he is reiterating his warning that, quote, all hell will break out in the Middle East if the captives held by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip are not returned before Donald Trump is sworn in. Trump added that failure to do so, quote, will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. Trump has not elaborated on what exactly he is threatening, but several of his nominees for key cabinet positions and for U.S. ambassador to Israel are advocates for a total war of annihilation against the Palestinians, not just of Gaza, but also of the West Bank. Some of these nominees have said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. Over the past several weeks, international mediators from Egypt and Qatar have been meeting with Hamas, with U.S. officials, with Israeli officials, in an effort to reach some form of an agreement on an exchange of captives and a cessation of Israel's attacks and war against the Palestinians of Gaza. While the U.S. and Israel have consistently accused Hamas of hindering a deal, there is a well-documented year-long pattern of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government acting as the central saboteurs of these ceasefire efforts. In a statement this week to Dropsite News, a senior Hamas official directly appealed to Donald Trump, saying, we believe we can reach an agreement immediately if Netanyahu and his government stop their stalling and obstructing of the deal. This Hamas official went on, we're ready to proceed with an agreement immediately that guarantees a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of all Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, the return of displaced people to their homes without restrictions, a serious prisoner exchange deal from both sides, and the immediate launch of a comprehensive relief and reconstruction process for Gaza. Hamas has called on Donald Trump and his team to, quote, exert pressure on Netanyahu and his government to move forward with a deal before Trump's inauguration. I'm joined now by Mohammed Shahada, a Palestinian writer and journalist from Gaza, who has been doing some of the most in-depth reporting on these negotiations for a ceasefire and exchange of captives. His most recent piece for the Center for International Policy is titled The Biden Administration's False History of Ceasefire Negotiations. Mohammed, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Mohammed, let's just begin with the latest. Hamas is saying that the Israelis, as we've seen happen for many, many months now, are inserting new demands at the 11th hour, while U.S. officials are saying, we're on the verge of a breakthrough. Walk us through what you understand is happening right now.
Well, right now it's pretty simple. Biden put a deal on the table on May 31st that was endorsed by the UN Security Council a couple of weeks later, rejected by Netanyahu. He said it does not accurately depict Israel's position, although that deal was articulated by Israel's own negotiating team. They went behind Netanyahu's back to Biden and said, you should propose this to the Israeli public, make a speech that speaks over Netanyahu's head to the Israeli population and try to convince them of that deal. That deal has been accepted by Hamas on the 2nd of July. And ever since, all negotiations were back and forth trying to convince Israel to accept that deal. That's pretty much it. Netanyahu tries every time to insert a huge amount of ludicrous demands every time there's a round of negotiations, the most prominent of which is to prevent people from returning displaced Gazans, over 1 million people that were displaced to the southern half, preventing them or restricting their return to the north again. The other demand is concerning the IDF permanent or indefinite stay in Gaza itself. Hamas's position, on the other hand, has been to say that we can negotiate all the details in place, numbers of hostages to be released, how long is Israel going to stay in Gaza, the withdrawal phases. But the most important thing is that a deal means two things. It means that the war will cease at the end of it. The war will not continue indefinitely. And number two is that Israel will leave Gaza. The IDF would withdraw from the Gaza Strip. And these two demands, I would say, are fairly representative of the entire Palestinian population, not least in the Gaza Strip itself, that if Hamas compromises on either of them, it would be a complete sellout from the perspective of any average Gazan, which is why there is this tremendous insistence on them that a ceasefire means actually a ceasefire. The Israeli position has consistently been, or Netanyahu's position to be more specific, that a ceasefire means a temporary pause to get hostages out and then the fighting resumes again.
Now, you've been talking to international diplomats, including Arab diplomats from countries that have been directly involved with these negotiations, as well as talking to sources within Hamas. And my understanding is that the basic outline of this deal is not markedly different from what Hamas agreed to as of last summer. In fact, I was shown documents proving that Hamas had informed formally the mediators in early July that they had accepted the so-called Biden framework that also had been endorsed by the United Nations. What have you heard from your sources in the international community about why a deal has not been signed since that point when Joe Biden basically told the world it's imminent last summer?
Well, actually, Hamas accepted it as early as May last year. So, if you remember correctly, the first 5 months of the war in Gaza, Biden expressly prohibited the use of the word ceasefire. No one was allowed to use it, not just in the US, in Europe, in Canada, in Australia, all the countries that are tailing the US foreign policy, they were only using a temporary pause. By March, there was a change of heart in Washington due to a number of reasons. One of them was the belief that the war has exhausted itself. There are no more military targets, and Hamas couldn't be eradicated. So the US changes its position, and a deal is developed by early April with Egypt, Qatar, and the US combined. At some point, Bill Burns, the chief of the CIA, was literally sitting in the room adjacent to the Hamas delegation. And every time the Egyptians would go and talk to Hamas about the details of the deal, they would give their feedback. The Egyptians would take it back to Bill Burns. Bill Burns would try to, with his own handwriting, to formulate a new change of certain clauses and articles in the deal, and was micromanaged to that level. It was very serious at the time. Early May, Hamas accepts it. As soon as Hamas says yes, Netanyahu invades Rafah. The invasion of Rafah, it was Biden's biggest red line at the time. But Biden has been promising for a long time he's going to cut or suspend arms to Israel if it went along with that move. As soon as they do it, he does absolutely nothing. We have an ICJ ruling by May 24th that says hands off Rafah, stop the military operation there immediately. So Biden is under pressure to do something about the ICJ telling Israel to stop the Rafah invasion. And he comes up with the Israeli proposal that Israel's negotiating team articulated 4 days before, and it was very much embracing Hamas's formula that they responded to the Egyptians with on May 6th. So that the Israeli team goes to Netanyahu with that proposal. Netanyahu says, you don't know how to negotiate, you don't know how to run a deal. They go to Biden instead. Biden makes that grand speech, primetime TV, and basically it was for three reasons. Number one, the ICJ decision. Number two, because Biden's red line was violated very expressly and he did absolutely nothing about it. And number three, because the Israeli military and security establishment was fed up with Netanyahu, that they were screaming for help from the Americans. So at that point, you have a concrete deal in place. The problem with that deal was that Biden was, I would say, like in a childish, ridiculous way, trying to put a ginormous loophole in the deal that allows a resumption of fighting or the resumption of the war again on Gaza after the 42 days. And that loophole was in Article 8 and Article 14, in which the summary of it is that it said the ceasefire would continue as long as Hamas negotiates in good faith, and Israel will negotiate with Hamas on the phase two of the deal on this day, specific day of the first phase, among other things, on the number of prisoners that will be released. Among other things, it opens the door for Netanyahu to say, okay, I want to negotiate with Hamas, sending all of Hamas's members to Mars or to the moon. And if they say no to this, then they are not negotiating in good faith. That means I can resume the war again. So Hamas says that we accept Biden's deal as long as you close that loophole. The Americans run back and forth with a lot of tricks and manipulations. By July 2nd, there is an agreement. There is a concrete deal. And that deal has been, as I said before, it's been consistently the only realistic deal in place since then. Israel, as soon as the deal is accepted by Hamas, Netanyahu imposes four conditions that even his own negotiators say are impossible to implement or would render any deal impossible. Number one is Israel maintains indefinite presence in the Philadelphia corridor. Number two, Israel maintains indefinite presence in the Netzarim corridor. That's the one that dissects Gaza in two halves and restricts the return of people back to the north. And number three, increasing the number of hostages that would be released, maximizing them as much as possible. And number four is a demand of the list from Hamas, a list of all the living hostages in Gaza at the moment. And Hamas has been saying that this is logistically impossible because according to Israel itself, even according to the US, Hamas's chains of command and control have been largely dismantled throughout Gaza. There's like a complete disconnect between different Hamas cells that are operating autonomously, and Gaza's under the most sophisticated surveillance worldwide that anyone can think of. So in that combination, if Hamas was to reach out to its members on the ground and say, tell us if the hostages you're keeping are alive or dead, that means compromising the locations of the captives and their captors. So Hamas has been saying, as soon as there is a ceasefire, on the first week of the ceasefire, we can come up with that list and show you who's alive and who's dead. So the negotiations die there. Netanyahu goes ahead with assassinating Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's top negotiator, assassinating the top military leader in Hezbollah, Fuad Shukr, and that collapses the negotiations. Iran, Hezbollah say we have to retaliate, but we would not retaliate if there is a ceasefire in Gaza. So there is a revival of the ceasefire in mid-August. But there was a ridiculous thing about that round of negotiations is that the US issued a joint statement with Qatar and Egypt saying there is a positive atmosphere. We're very close to a deal. Everything is pinky-dory. Everything is working out well. There's a breakthrough. The only twist to it is that Hamas didn't even show up to the negotiating table. There were no negotiations in the first place. The Americans came up with something called a bridging proposal. They said, let's throw Biden's proposal into the garbage bin and let's come up with a bridging proposal that embraces every single one of Netanyahu's ridiculous demands that even Israel's negotiating team has been rejecting and telling Netanyahu that they are unworkable. So the Americans come up with this approach, and to lure Hamas to the table, they say, okay, Israel has been vetoing 100 names of the heavily sentenced prisoners that you demanded, 300 heavily sentenced prisoners like Marwan Barghouti, Ahmad Saadat, and others. We managed to reduce that to 75 vetoed names. Now we will bring it down to 65 if you show up to the negotiating table. Hamas says, you made a concrete proposal that was endorsed by the UN Security Council. We will abide with this, but we will not get stuck in a limbo of indefinite negotiations. So this round of negotiations die as well, but you have this fake positive statement being issued that the Americans insisted on for three reasons: to prevent Hezbollah Iran from attacking Israel, to, at least that was their claim, to create pressure inside Israel and Netanyahu to seal the deal, which I think is largely false. And number three, to allow Kamala Harris's DNC to pass peacefully without any disruption, so that every time somebody points out the Gaza war, the American administration would say, look, we're very close to a deal. So that's pretty much it. Ever since, immediately after that, the negotiations die out completely. No more talk on ceasefire in Gaza. That by November, Qatar decides to tell the Hamas leadership there, go out, leave the country. I hear that point constantly, that if Qatar was to pressure Hamas hard enough, Hamas would capitulate or compromise. There's nothing harder they could do than kicking them all out, which is what they did in November. They shut down their office. They said it was a temporary suspension, shut down their office. Qatar withdrew from acting as a mediator and told all of Hamas's leadership, leave Qatar immediately. A lot of them left to Turkey or other destinations. So that is basically the death of the deal. Biden as well stopped trying, but he adopted a different approach, which frustrated the Qataris, the Israelis as well, and the Egyptians. Is the White House has been ever since August telling the whole world that Hamas is the obstacle to the deal, that Israel accepted the deal on the table and Hamas did not, which even Israeli officials themselves would describe as gaslighting, as rewriting of history to absolve Biden of failing to hold Netanyahu accountable.
To go back to the issue of Donald Trump, there are elements of this that have some kind of a whiff of the hostage negotiations that Ronald Reagan engaged in prior to taking power in 1980, where he sort of subverted Jimmy Carter. I don't think it's a direct analogy, but Trump does seem to think that he has sway over Netanyahu. And Trump is a transactional guy. There's also indications that Trump doesn't particularly like Bibi. I mean, even though that's the dominant perception, there's recordings that have been leaked that indicate that Trump's not a major fan of Netanyahu, although his rhetoric is very pro-Israel, pro-war of annihilation against the Palestinians. But there is some nuance to it. Who do you think is playing the other here? Do you think Trump is in the driver's seat with this, or do you think Netanyahu? Because I think there's a level, and this is just, informed speculation on my part. I think there's a level on which Trump just kind of wants the mess to be put in the closet for a while so he can do his inauguration, get a hard reset, move on from the kind of Biden era, and then he's going to figure out what he wants to do. And you indicated before, normalization with Saudi Arabia is in play. He really is proud of the so-called Abraham Accords. But it does seem like the first phase of this, from Trump's perspective, is I want to be able to claim a victory that I implemented by getting hostages released. And then you have this other phase. So I'm wondering who's playing who here, Netanyahu or Trump?
Well, basically, Netanyahu is a master manipulator. You can give him that. You can say he's been manipulating Biden for the last 15 months. In August, you got a leak from the White House saying that Biden realized Netanyahu has been lying to him, which is a surprise. Obama told you that about a decade ago, very openly, on a hot mic moment captured, in which he said Netanyahu is a lying or a pathological liar or something of the sort. With the difference between Biden and Trump, on a positive note, in Trump's favor, unfortunately, Biden is ideological. Trump is not. I have a Saudi diplomat who told me about 2 months ago. She said that at the end of Biden's term, they reached the conclusion there's nothing that he's going to do in his lame duck period. Zero. Absolutely nothing. There's no change of heart whatsoever, not even before or after Kamala Harris's loss. There's nothing that he's considering to do to pressure Israel or to do differently. And she said, quote, that Biden considers any change on Israel, Gaza in his remainder of his term to be, quote, attained on his legacy. He wants his legacy to be the most pro-Israeli president in history. Whereas, it's ideologically driven. It's insane. Whereas for Trump, he's not an ideologue. He's a clown, a lunatic in many ways. I shouldn't say that publicly. But basically, at the same time, as you said, he's a businessman, transactional. But there are two caveats there. On the positive, American diplomats or former diplomats are telling us that Trump genuinely wants a Nobel Peace Prize. And he believes that he can get it this time around. So they say there is a window of opportunity to squeeze in some details on Gaza, on the occupation, on Saudi normalization, lump them up together and present it to him because he doesn't have an eye for detail. He doesn't care for details. The other issue is that on the negative side, Trump is easily manipulated by the circle of people around him. And he's not going to give himself a headache. It's not a hill to die on, not just Gaza, but Palestine in its entirety. It's not a big topic. It's not something in the interest of his constituents or people around him or the billionaire class supporting him, whatever. But in terms of manipulation, there's one episode that I find extremely remarkable, but also catastrophic. So in 2017, I think, Trump goes to Beit Lahem and visits the Palestinian president there, Mahmoud Abbas. They meet together. They had a great meeting. And someone from Trump's administration recently told me that Trump really likes Mahmoud Abbas. He gets along well with him. Most Palestinians don't, but good for him, good for us as well. Now, in that meeting in Beit Lahem, Abbas presents Trump with maps on the two-state solution, with the Palestinian Authority's official position, a demilitarized state, 22% of historic Palestine, all these issues. Trump gets very impressed. He says, they told me you're an extremist. And he sort of agrees to everything Mahmoud Abbas presented him with. And he says at the end of it, he says it like, I'm not sure if it was serious or a joke, but he says to Mahmoud Abbas, when you come to the land swap part in the negotiations on a Palestinian state with Israel, giving up the settlement blocks in return for lands inside Israel itself, He told Abbas, come back to me because I'm a businessman. I worked in real estate. I know how to pick up a good piece of land, literally. But here's the twist. As soon as Trump leaves the room, Jared Kushner goes back to the Palestinians and said to Saeb Erekat at the time, the chief Palestinian negotiator, he says, remember what Trump just told you? Forget everything he said. None of it matters. And then he walks out. So all of it obliterated as soon as he left the room. We've seen a huge amount of evidence afterwards of how Netanyahu, Kushner, and others have been manipulating Trump into being the most hostile president towards Palestinians in memorable history. So it's not far-fetched that it's going to happen again. If you look at Trump's immediate circle now that he appointed on Israel-Palestine, every choice is more catastrophic than the one before. It's way worse than his previous term. You have people that believe there's no such thing as Palestinians to begin with. So how do you negotiate with those people?
Final question. Do you get the sense that there is a strong possibility that at least an initial phase of a deal could materialize prior to Trump's inauguration?
Yes, there is a huge hope on that. At the moment, it all depends on Trump pressuring Netanyahu towards it. Just give Bibi one signal. There's one thing that is important to mention. Netanyahu is afraid of Trump, and that's something that they talk about regularly in Israeli media. He fears that the last time around Trump called him out, he said, Netanyahu, fuck this guy. And because he felt that Netanyahu betrayed him after he lost in 2022. So basically, 2020, sorry. So basically, there is a profound fear on the Israeli part to step on Trump's foot, to anger him on the first day in the job. They are keen to not get him hostile towards them. So you saw, I think yesterday, Trump shared a video by Jeffrey Sachs in which he's saying that Netanyahu is a son of a bitch who got us into Iraq. That was incredibly remarkable. So in that regard, there is a window of opportunity there, a genuine one, to at least seal the first phase of the deal. It all depends on just one signal from Washington, from either Biden or Trump. Like the mediators, Arab mediators, they told me repeatedly that if Biden was to name and shame Netanyahu publicly on record in a speech or just leak it to the media, it would have a profound impact on the negotiations. It would create a lot of pressure inside Israel itself on Netanyahu to seal a deal. But instead, Biden is doing the opposite. He's trying to absolve himself of the responsibility for failing repeatedly to hold Netanyahu accountable by blaming everything on Hamas. Now, I think there is at least a chance for the first phase of the deal to be sealed. Hamas's position, there's no guarantee that Israel would continue the second phase, especially under a Trump administration. It becomes more likely that Israel would just get 33 hostages out and then go back to the war again. But Hamas wants the maximum plausibility possible that the phase 2 of the deal would be seen through. There is a possibility there. The question is what would it take?
The Western media isn't showing you right now is that we are witnessing one of the largest led student movements in the area since 1968 in Serbia right now. 62 out of 80 universities have been shut down by their own students, 24-hour blockades have been taking place, self-organizing resistance hubs and education hubs have been organized by the students themselves. Along with this, hundreds of people have been going, thousands on the streets all over Serbia demanding for systems change and less corruption in their government. This shows that people-led movements will never be shown through Western media.
There was a fascinating case in Brazil last week where a federal judge, unbeknownst to anybody, had a case before the court that urged the court to detain and criminally investigate a soldier from the Israeli Defense Forces, an Israeli citizen who had traveled to Brazil in December to vacation in Brazil, and the court accepted that request and ordered that soldier criminally investigated. As it turned out, though, that before the court could issue that order, either the police or the prosecutor or someone inside the court leaked to the Israeli government that this was about to happen, and they were able to smuggle the soldier out in the middle of the night to Argentina. And obviously, it's pretty interesting that the person charged with war crimes was in Brazil and then fled to Argentina, given that's where most Nazi war criminals went after the Nuremberg trials and after World War II to hide. That's where all the Nazi hunters, the iconic Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal and others, would find all the Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann in 1961. He was hiding in Argentina. So that symbolism shouldn't be lost. But the reason this is happening is because Israeli soldiers have been endlessly posting on social media. They even got criticized by Donald Trump for doing it. Incredibly sadistic and obviously criminal and illegal actions that they're proud of and that they film and they post on their social media and celebrate with music and dance and jokes and fun. The Hind Rajab Foundation was created in the wake of an absolutely horrific murder of a 6-year-old Palestinian girl in Gaza that you're about to hear about. That was her name, Hind Rajab. And this foundation was created to track down and create dossiers on the war criminals in the IDF who are publicly boasting about their war crimes, and then use the force of the law, nothing else, to go around the world in order to make sure that countries that are signatories to the International Criminal Court and the Rome Statute, and therefore duty-bound to investigate war criminals on their soil, actually do so. And that's what just happened in Brazil. It brought the attention to a lot of people's attention, the work of this group. And just a little bit ago, we spoke to the president of this group, Diab Abu Jaja, about the group's work in tracking these IDF admissions of war crimes, the legal proceedings the group is bringing against them around the world, including the one they just brought in Brazil. There are many others. And also the very serious, incredible threats of violence, of terrorism that they are getting, not from anonymous Israelis, but from top-level Israeli officials in public, all as a result of the success that they are now having in scaring Israelis about whether or not they're going to be able to travel freely if they participated in war crimes and publicly documented it. I found this work that he's doing very noble, not just because of the obvious need to enforce laws about war criminality, but because of the obvious dangers that he's knowingly incurring, and that he knew, obviously, before he did it, he would incur threats that are very real, given the complete sociopathic willingness of the Israeli government to cross any line that they've demonstrated over and over. And yet he's continuing in this work, and it's starting to have a real effect. And I found the interview very affecting and very enlightening. And I strongly believe that you will too. Here is our conversation with Mr. Jaja. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's great to see you, and I appreciate your coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the organization of which you're a part is the Hind Rajab Foundation, and it made a lot of big news over the last couple of weeks, in large part because of a success that you had in Brazil, where you were able to convince a federal court that the presence of an IDF soldier on Brazilian soil obligated the Brazilian government to investigate that person for war crimes. He was able to end up escaping Brazil, fleeing Brazil, but it caused a lot of concern in Israel, a lot of anger in Israel, and I want to get into the details of that. But before we do, can you talk to me a little bit about the Hind Rajab Foundation and how it got that name?
Right. So, some 14 months ago, a group of people convened to think of what we can do in order to try to, organize something around the ongoing genocide in Gaza. It was November 2023, and then we started something called the March 30 movement. The idea was to do some advocacy, but also to do some legal work. After a while, we noticed that our legal work is quite developing on an important pace, and that a lot of lawyers are starting to volunteer So we decided to separate the advocacy from the legal work and to create an organization that can streamline everything and focus on litigation. So based on that, we launched the Hind Rajab Foundation. We selected to call it, the Hind Rajab Foundation because of the story of Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old girl that was killed together with her family in Gaza in very extremely dramatic circumstances. I believe many people are familiar with the story, but for those who are not, to sum it up, Hind was with her family in a car. The car was taken under fire from an Israeli tank. Almost everyone in the car died except Hind and a cousin of hers, also a 12-year-old. Eventually, the cousin managed to call the equivalent of 911. The people were talking to her on the phone. The cousin died. Hind could take the phone, and she stayed on the call even after her young cousin, also of 12-year-old, died, and she was talking to the ambulance service, and that call obviously was recorded, and you could hear her begging the people to come and take her, talking about how she's surrounded by the dead bodies of her family. Eventually, the whole world was aware of this situation as it was unfolding. It went viral. An ambulance was sent to save her. That ambulance was also took fire also from an Israeli tank, and 2 rescue workers died in that ambulance. And eventually, when Hind was found, she was dead, and some reports speak of some 300 bullets through her body. So for us, this is a very telling event or story to represent what's going on in Gaza since end of October or mid-October 2023, especially because many of the victims have been children. And so this is a bit the idea that, seeking justice for Hind is also seeking justice for everybody who's a victim of this genocide.
Let me ask you about this case in Brazil, because that, I think, is really what put this work on a lot of people's radar. We're based in Brazil, so it was an immense story here, a gigantic story, where essentially you discovered, and I want you to tell the story and how this happened, but you discovered that there was an IDF soldier who was vacationing in Brazil, had come here, I think, in late December, the second half of December, and had a long social history record of documenting a lot of these war crimes. And so you went into a federal court and argued to the judge, not to the government, but to the judge, that Brazil, as a signatory to the Rome Statute, is not only permitted but required to investigate the person, to hold him, to see whether or not he's guilty of these crimes under the Rome Statute. And the court agreed with you, and then the Israelis were able to kind of covertly, if they had help from the Brazilian military, we'll find out, from Brazilian intelligence, but able to get him out of the country and have him flee. How did that all happen? I mean, I don't think it was really public until the court order was issued. How is it that you discovered that he was here? How do you kind of get ready to bring a case like that in such a short time while the person is vacationing?
Right. Well, the main important, or the main issue that the main way of operating is that we do not wait until somebody is in a country before we start preparing the evidence. So, as I said, we have extensive data. This data is being analyzed by our legal teams continuously, and we are building files continuously against war criminals or suspected war criminals. So, we have priority lists, and these priority lists are, of course, depending on the crimes committed. What did these people do? What did they actually, commit? And, so the case against Mr. Yuval Baghdadi was already ready. It was already one of the priority cases. How do we discover that a certain person is in a country, it's because they tell us they are. They just post this on their social media. And so our researchers monitor that, obviously. And, you just receive an alert that somebody posted, and they check that post. And then when somebody's posting that they are in Rio de Janeiro or they are in Sao Paulo, then they are in Brazil. So the system that we have internally, the process that we set up is that the researchers then inform the legal teams. The legal teams look at the file and then decide of the action to do. And this is what we did. So the file was already ready on the level of evidence. Obviously, we did some paralegal preparation work, and then we chose a lawyer in Brazil. And we gave them the file. And then the lawyer, of course, completed the file, adapted the file to Brazilian legislation, because you have always two levels to, on the level of the conception of the complaint. You have always the international law and the local law. So the Brazilian lawyer obviously completed the file, did some tremendous work on it, and then filed it. Lodged it as an official complaint. That complaint goes to the prosecutor. The prosecutor cannot but acknowledge the facts and the jurisdiction, passes it to a court. The court actually gave an order to the police to execute. So there was a court order to the Brazilian Federal Police to actually intercept, investigate, and then couple back to the judge to see what to do with Mr. Baghdadi. So this is the situation. And for us, it wasn't a surprise. We knew that sooner or later this was going to happen, because initially in Cyprus, the same thing happened with another case, but then the Israelis smuggled the guy out of Cyprus before the judge could issue an order. So in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, the Israelis smuggled other soldiers out of the countries, even though in these countries the legal mechanism and dynamic is different. So when this happened, obviously, we did not communicate. Most of our cases, we do not communicate about them. So we only communicated when we had clear indication that the subject has been alerted. Because, when we saw that he started deleting his posts, that he closed his profiles, and then we realized that he's on the move, that he has been alerted, and that was the case. So there was a leak, okay? And that leak, we have no evidence where did it come from, but there was definitely a leak to him. And then we decided to communicate. So this is what happened. Obviously, the subject then went to Argentina. He was actually smuggled to Argentina, or taken to. The Israelis openly said that it was a joint operation from the Ministry of, I think, Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Justice.
In Brazil, with the collaboration of the Brazilian Ministry of Justice and Foreign Affairs?
No.
With the Argentine?
No, the Israeli.
With the Israeli? Yeah. The Israeli Foreign, exactly.
So,
but did they indicate, do you know whether they worked with any Brazilian military officials? There's obviously a lot of Israel support among the Brazilian right in particular. Do you have any knowledge about that?
Well, one Israeli minister just actually revealed a few days ago that he sent a note to Eduardo Bolsonaro, and he asked him to intervene on this. Eduardo Bolsonaro being also an officer of the federal police. So there are suspicions. I don't want to create theories here or conspiracy theories on this, but the fact of the matter is the soldier was alerted. And there are three possibilities. We know it did not come from us. So it's the prosecution, it's the judge, or it's the police. So it's one of the three. So I don't know. Let's keep it at that. Anyway, when he went to Argentina, we filed the case against him in Argentina. He was then smuggled to Miami in the United States. And then he was taken from Miami to Israel, taken back to Israel. So this is what happened. For us, regardless of this outcome, which can be, I think, interesting from an anecdotic point of view, but on the legal level, what happened is that a Brazilian court acknowledged jurisdiction based on the Rome Statute without any order or arrest warrant from the ICC, which is the first time that this happens. And this sets a precedent for judges everywhere. That's why the Israelis became very nervous. A lot of people do not realize that. It's maybe technical, it's boring, but I think this is the news here, that a judge in a country on the national level said, oh, I don't need the ICC to apply their own statute. I can do that. So far, we have been asking that, but nobody really answered positively, oh, yes, we will apply the Rome Statute ourselves. So this happened in Brazil, and this sets a precedent now. A lot of judges now feel that they maybe can do that also in other countries. So, it always takes that first step, that first judge that will take the risk and say, look, actually, according to the book, I do not need to wait for the ICC. So this is why it's a huge legal breakthrough. And yeah, we are very hopeful because of that. So this is what I want to say. This is not going to stop. I personally decided for myself that I'm not going to stop. But even if I did at a certain moment feel, I cannot take it anymore, believe me, the work does not depend on that. The work will continue. And I believe justice is coming. And again, justice is in the interest of everyone, including these Israeli soldiers who now are acting as if they are not human, because that attitude of we are untouchable, we can do whatever, this is not human, and this is what a friend of mine told me recently. He said we are actually rehumanizing them by holding them accountable. We are telling them you are human beings, just like anybody else. You can also fear. You can also feel, I cannot just post things like that and think that I'm above humanity and above the law and above everything. So for the future of everyone, including them, including their children, this is important work. And I believe people will see that one day.
Yeah, there was actually some recent psychological studies published in the Israeli media that documented how a lot of IDF soldiers start getting God complexes when they enter into Gaza because they can kill anybody they want, they can order people to do whatever they want, they can blow up whatever they want. And that is extremely toxic and unhealthy for human beings. Of course, you get dehumanized the more you start thinking that you have absolute power, that nobody can hold you accountable in any way. That's just not a healthy way to live. Well,
absolutely.
I don't want to give you false assurances. My personal view has always been that if somebody intends to take action against you, they keep it to themselves. And if they're just frustrated and angry and need to blow off steam, they threaten you over the internet. And I think as everything you just said is something the Israelis are well aware of too. It's not as though you and you alone have some sort of secret that you're about to reveal so that, taking you out of the picture would prevent it. But you are definitely doing risky work. It's work that is extremely important. I have a lot of admiration for what you're doing. Can you just let people know how, if they want to support your organization and this work, they can do so before I let you go?
Well, the easiest way is to go on our website. It's Hindrajab Foundation in one word.org. And you have all the information about us. You have all the information about our cases, running cases that we communicated about, and how you can support, volunteer, or donate, or any other way of supporting us.
So I know I don't need to say this, but keep up the great work. We'd love to have you back on when other things start developing, and I appreciate your taking the time. All right, bye-bye. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.
While 40 million Californians suffer through unprecedented drought, one billionaire couple owns a massive share of the state's water system, seized in a series of secretive meetings 2 decades ago. That system was largely paid for by the very taxpayers whose water these billionaires hold hostage. Urban water systems are desperate for water, but in 2023, they'll receive just 5% of what they requested from the state. The Resnicks are the biggest farmers in California. As of 2007, they owned 4 San Francisco's worth of farmland. And nearly half of Americans buy at least one of their products. Their pistachios, their pomegranate juice, their mandarins, their flowers. It's all under one massive umbrella, the Wonderful Company. A privately owned company worth at least $5 billion. The majority owners, the Resnicks, are worth at least $8 billion. How were they able to take over such a large percentage of what should be a shared public resource? This is The Classroom from More Perfect Union, and today we're looking at how the Resnicks got rich. Linda is a former child actress, the daughter of Jack Harris, a successful movie distributor of the 1950s, most well known for The Blob.
Starring Steve McQueen and a cast of exciting young people.
At 19, she founded her own advertising agency. Stewart was born to a middle-class New Jersey family and started his first business, a janitorial service, in grad school. He eventually acquired American Protection Services, a burglar alarm and security company. Linda approached him about marketing services for the company, and they hit it off, not knowing that one day they'd work together to take over California's water. The lovebirds became business partners. They bought Teleflora, the flower delivery company, and the Franklin Mint, purveyors of inane little tchotchkes. Linda was the marketing person, and Stewart was in charge of business. As Linda told the LA Times in 1993, "I've always said that Stewart and I together make one perfect person, like little salt and pepper shakers." In the late 80s, they found their primary industry, agriculture. They got into the pistachio business. Linda said, "We've done more for the pistachio than anyone ever since it was planted in the Garden of Eden. My husband should be canonized for all the work he's done." They started branching into other products, almonds, pomegranates, citrus, wine, and acquiring more and more land to cover it, including some very important land in Kern County, which granted them water rights in the area. As the Resnicks were building their empire, the state of California was building new water infrastructure with taxpayer money. California's natural water supply is very inconsistent. Vastly differing amounts of rainfall means the state can go from surplus to drought and back very easily. So they build water banks to store water during surpluses to have during droughts. One important storage facility is the Kern Water Bank, started in 1988. The facility was built with hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, which could have been a good thing. The people of California would have owned the water. But there were two Californians thirstier than the rest, and they wanted more water: Linda and Stewart Resnick, and they had a lot of political power. We'll get to that. In 1994, state water officials, water infrastructure contractors, and agricultural landowners with water rights arranged a secretive meeting at a resort in Monterey Bay, California. These groups, a mix of private companies and public agencies, rewrote California's water rules without any input from voters, taxpayers, or legislators. The new rules, called the Monterey Plus Agreement or the Monterey Amendments, were devastating for working Californians, and great for agriculture billionaires. The original code included urban preference, a long-standing rule that in times of drought, the state water board would give urban areas, where people live, access to water supplies before agricultural interests. Monterey axed that. That means that in times of drought, the water systems for normal Californians would have to buy water from private companies, because they weren't getting it from the state. The new agreement also loosened regulations on paper water. That's water that doesn't necessarily exist anywhere but on paper. The full quantities of water that providers could have, but don't actually need to have. Today, 5 times as much water has been promised and sold as actually exists. And importantly, the meeting changed ownership of the Kern Water Bank. What once belonged to the state was transferred to a few private water contractors, one of which was Westside Mutual, a wholly owned subsidiary of Wonderful Foods. The wonderful employee who runs Westside, Bill Phillimore, is the chairman of the public organization that manages the Kern Water Bank. Boom. One secret meeting, and the Resnicks owned nearly 60% of an important California water resource, built with hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money. The new ownership, combined with the rules on paper and surplus water, meant that during times of drought, the Resnicks could sell Kern water back to the state water systems. They took Californian taxpayers' water and sold it back to them, both literally as the water supply and also to grow expensive food like gourmet pistachios and pomegranate juice. They converted the people's water into products many can't afford. And that's just one water bank. The Resnicks also have control of other water boards and have been sued for directing more water towards their properties. So how do they get away with this Chinatown-level chicanery?
Gonna be a lot of irate citizens when they find out that they're paying for water that they're not gonna get.
With philanthropy. The Resnicks donate millions of dollars to politicians and research institutions, which help them secure control over water systems, and even get more water and more taxpayer funding. One important project is the proposed California Delta Tunnel, a taxpayer-funded project which would send water from Northern California to Central, where the Resnicks farms are. They've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on state and federal legislation and politicians who support the tunnel project. But their favorite politician is Senator Dianne Feinstein.
You come in here and you say it has to be my way or the highway.
Chair of the Energy and Water Subcommittee. She's a close personal friend of the Resnicks, attending their holiday parties in Aspen and maintaining their financial interests. A quick look through the bills she sponsored shows several which would direct money to Kern-adjacent water projects. The Resnicks even ask her for things directly. When a pesky study about endangering salmon and shad fisheries threatened the Delta Tunnel, Stewart wrote a letter to Feinstein demanding a new study. She immediately forwarded it to the Obama administration, who agreed to spend $750,000 on a new study. It returned the same results as the first one. Can't buy science. But the Resnicks have tried. They are among the top donors to the University of California system, with their donations focusing on agricultural and ecological studies. The Resnicks have basically bought entire departments who put out studies on how water systems should be managed, and where funding should go. That leads to even more federal and state taxpayer dollars being used to fix up what the Resnicks profit off of. This is all bad for California, even in a capitalistic sense. Agriculture uses 80% of California's water, but only represents 2% of its GDP. The Resnicks' water monopoly is just one way their quest for wealth hurts the rest of us. They allegedly lobby for increased tensions with Iran to keep embargoes on superior Iranian pistachios. Their giant crops lead to monocultures which kill important pollinators. They siphon taxpayer dollars into the company town charter schools they own, set up to train children to work for their farms. And of course, like any company of this size, they exploit their workers. We need to treat water for what it is: a necessary public resource, a human right, and something that shouldn't be owned by anyone, and work towards legislative change that stops people like the Resnicks from stealing it. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll be covering the stories of other billionaires and multimillionaires to examine the policy failures that made them rich, as well as the worker-empowering stories and explainers you're used to.
Is this holdback a moral one, a legal one? Is it significant, or is it just politics?
Well, I think that the revulsion worldwide in what Israel is doing, and the realization, which I think is at the core, that what Israel is doing is in the service of a political agenda. This is the most important thing to keep in mind. Wars come from politics. The Israeli politics right now is an extremist politics which says Israel will rule over the Palestinian people, those who are not expelled or those who are not killed. So this is so-called Greater Israel. It's a disaster, Israel. But that's the politics. The politics is completely unacceptable. It's completely illegal. It's completely unsustainable. But that's what the war is about. Rather than having a political solution, Israel thinks that it can do this by war. It can't. It can only do this by war if the United States is completely complicit in this. So when you ask, does the UK mean it? All over the world, the publics want this fighting to stop. This is dangerous for everybody. It's murderous when it comes to the Palestinians, but it's dangerous for the whole world. Everybody wants, after all these decades, stop the damn fighting, stop the killing, because you're threatening global peace. You're threatening an escalation to world war. And we're not going to stand there and do this so that Israel can have an apartheid regime or commit ethnic cleansing or commit genocide in Gaza. No. So this is what's happening country by country. The United States is the last holdout. If the United States took an active policy for peace, peace would come because the United States would say with the rest of the world, this is how it's going to be. International law, 2 states, 4th of June, 1967 borders, State of Palestine, 194th UN member state, capital in East Jerusalem. It's all there, the solution on the table. The US is the last holdout.
حبيبي، قالوا لي إنهم كانوا ينقوا عليك على قصة التوب اللي لابسه. كانوا يقولوا لك إنه زمن التوب عدى ودخلنا عصر البدلات. كانوا يحكوا لك إنه الناس رح تضحك علينا وبدنا تفوت معنا على الحضارة. وردك عليهم؟ قلت لهم لو بشيله بشيل جلدي. حبيبي، بتذكر لما كنت تحكي لي عن أيام زمان وكيف كانت الناس تعيش. نفسي أفهم، أنت كنت بتحكي لي عن زمان أو عن بكرة؟ عن الأسلوب أو المسلوب؟ وضحت. الحضارة اللي كانوا بيعزموك عليها شوف شو سوت بالدنيا. ناطحات سحاب بتدق عبواب السما نستنا الأرض اللي تحتينا. كيف وصلنا من عندك لهون؟ حبيبي، بشوف تاريخنا بعيونك، والله يعينك على حملك. بعرف إنه ولا أصعب من قراراتك، وبعرف إنك حملت وزن مستقبلنا وماضينا عكتافك. وبقدر إنه المنطق بيقول لو بياخدوا بلادك ما بياخدوا أولادك. بس حبيبي، ليش كنت تقولي خليها بالقلب بتجرح ولا تطلع لبرا وتفضح؟ حبيبي بالقلب بتقتل. بعدين عأي أساس حكينا إنه لو طلعت ما رح تبني أساس جديد؟ عأي أساس حكينا إنه ماضينا ما بيكبر معنا وما بيحمل الحمل وبيزيد؟ عأي أساس حكينا إنه لازم أغير شكلي وصوتي ولغتي وأهلي لأنضم لبكرة؟ عأي أساس حكينا إنه الحقيقة اللي بشوفها بعيونك ما بتخلق حضارة؟ نحن الحضارة. حبيبي، تاريخك مستقبلي، وما بشيل التوب قبل ما يشيلوا لي جلدي. سجل أنا عربية وبعرف أصلي. قالوا ما حدا بتغير بنفس المكان، مين يحكي لهم إحنا غير؟ يا من حكى لنا قصايد عنا ما بتلبق لنا وليه؟ ولا حد يحكي لهم ليه؟ سنة قلبي عمره ما بينساه، اسمه هواه. وانا قلبي ما بينساه، اسمه هواه، اسمه هواه. شمسي أنا